They say a mother's love never dies, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes love means breaking down doors you were never supposed to open. I'm 73 years old, and I thought I'd seen everything life had to throw at me. I buried my husband, raised my children, weathered every storm with grace and patience. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the night. I found my 7-year-old grandson locked in a cold, dark garage, trembling and afraid. And when I confronted my son, the boy I raised with my own 2 hands, he looked at me with hollow eyes and whispered words that still haunt me. "She made me do it, Mom. She made me do it." That night, I realized that the worst monsters don't hide in shadows. They sit at your dinner table. They smile at family gatherings. And sometimes, they destroy the people you love most while you're too far away to see it happening. Hello, my dear friends. Welcome back to my corner of the world, where I share the stories that have shaped my life and the lessons that came with them. If you're new here, my name is Margaret, though most people just call me Grandma Maggie, and this channel is where I pour out my heart about family, love, and the complicated truths that come with living a long life. Before I continue with today's story, I want to ask you something. If my words touch your heart today, if anything I say resonates with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I'm here every single day with a new story, a new lesson, a new piece of my heart. And please, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Are you in Texas like me? Are you across the ocean in England or Australia? Are you listening while cooking dinner, or maybe driving home from work? I love knowing that my voice reaches you, wherever you are. It makes this old woman feel a little less alone in this big, complicated world. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. Back before that terrible night, when I still believed everything was fine. You see, I've always been what people call independent. After my husband Thomas passed away 6 years ago, I made a decision that I wouldn't be a burden to anyone. I kept my little house on Maple Street spotless, tended my garden every morning, went to church on Sundays, and maintained my dignity. I had my routines, my friends from the quilting circle, my Tuesday afternoon bridge games. Life was quiet, yes, but it was peaceful, manageable, safe. My son Daniel lived just 30 minutes away with his wife Melissa and their son Eli, my only grandchild. For the first few years after Eli was born, I saw them regularly. Every Sunday, they'd come for dinner. Daniel would help me fix whatever was broken around the house, and little Eli would run through my garden, chasing butterflies and picking flowers. Those were golden days, the kind that make you grateful for every breath you take. But then something changed. It happened so gradually that I didn't notice at first. The Sunday dinners became every other Sunday, then once a month, then we're just so busy. Mom, maybe next week. Daniel's phone calls became shorter, more strained. When I'd ask how everyone was doing, his answers became vague. "Fine, Mom. Everything's fine. Just work. You know how it is." But a mother knows. A mother always knows when something is wrong with her child, no matter how old that child gets. I'd hear something in his voice, a tightness, a hesitation, like he was choosing every word carefully, like someone was listening. I started calling more often, but my calls went to voicemail. I'd leave messages cheerful at first, then concerned, then almost desperate. "Daniel, honey, it's Mom again. Just wanted to hear your voice. Call me back when you can." He rarely did, and when he did call back, it was always rushed, always with an excuse. "Sorry, Mom. Things are crazy at work. Melissa's busy with Eli's school activities. We'll come visit soon, I promise." The promises never materialized. Months passed. I saw my grandson's 7th birthday come and go without being invited to the party. I sent a present, of course, a wooden train set that I knew he'd love, the kind his father had played with when he was little. I got a perfunctory thank you text from Melissa. Eli says thanks for the gift. Not even a photo. Not even a phone call from my grandson's own voice. That's when the worry really started to eat at me. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what I'd done wrong. Had I offended Melissa somehow? I'd always tried to be kind to her, to welcome her into our family. Sure, she was different from what I'd imagined. For Daniel, she came from money, had that polished, almost cold sophistication that made me feel like a country bumpkin. But I'd never said anything negative, never interfered in their marriage, always respected their boundaries. So why was I being pushed away? I started asking around, carefully, not wanting to seem like a gossiping old woman. At church, I ran into Betty Henderson, who lived 3 houses down from Daniel and Melissa. Oh, Margaret, she said when I mentioned my son's family, and something in her tone made my blood run cold. I probably shouldn't say anything, but, well, honey, there's been talk. Talk. That terrible word that can mean everything and nothing. Betty leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. That wife of his, Melissa, she's got quite the temper. We hear shouting sometimes, late at night, and I've seen Daniel leaving for work some mornings looking like he hasn't slept in days, thin as a rail. And that poor little boy, ... She trailed off, shaking her head. I'm sure it's nothing serious, but, well, you know how it is. Some marriages are just difficult. Difficult. Such a small word for such a huge concern. I went home that day with my heart pounding, my mind racing. I tried calling Daniel again. Voicemail. I tried Melissa's number, which I rarely used. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice cool and clipped. Margaret, what can I do for you? Not, hi mom, or how are you? Just that cold, transactional greeting. I stumbled through some excuse about wanting to bring over some cookies I'd baked, wanting to see Eli. That's not a good time, she said flatly. We're very busy. I'll let Daniel know you called. And she hung up. Just like that. No warmth, no invitation, no acknowledgement that I was Eli's grandmother, that I had any right to see my own family. I sat in my kitchen, holding the phone, feeling tears of frustration and fear prick at my eyes. Something was very, very wrong. And I was going to find out what. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. If they wouldn't invite me over, I'd go anyway. I'd surprise them, show up with cookies, and that grandmother's prerogative to be a little pushy, a little insistent. What could they do? Turn me away at the door? I was family. I had rights, so I spent an afternoon baking Eli's favorite chocolate chip cookies, the recipe I'd used for Daniel when he was a boy, with just a touch of cinnamon that made them special. I put on my good coat, the navy blue one Thomas had bought me for our anniversary years ago, and I drove those 30 minutes with my heart hammering the entire way. It was a Thursday evening, around 9:30. I'd chosen that time deliberately late enough that they'd be home from any activities, early enough that Eli wouldn't be in bed yet. I wanted to see my grandson. I needed to look into his eyes and know he was okay. When I pulled up to their house, everything looked normal at first. The lights were on downstairs. Melissa's expensive car was in the driveway next to Daniel's modest sedan. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the flower beds pristine. It looked like a picture from a magazine, one of those houses that seem almost too perfect to be real. I walked up to the front door, carrying my tin of cookies, and rang the doorbell. Nothing. I waited. Rang again. Still nothing. But I could hear sounds from inside, movement, maybe voices. I knocked, louder this time. Daniel, Melissa, it's Mom. I brought cookies for Eli. My voice sounded too bright, too cheerful, even to my own ears. Still no answer. That's when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it. A whimper, a child's cry, muffled and distant. My grandmother's instinct kicked in like a lightning bolt. I followed the sound around the side of the house, through the gate that led to the backyard. The crying was coming from the garage. The garage door was closed. But there was a side entrance, and my hand was already reaching for the knob before my mind could catch up with my body. It was unlocked. I pulled it open, and the sight that greeted me will be burned into my memory until the day I die. There, in that cold, dark garage, sitting on the concrete floor in just his pajamas, was my 7-year-old grandson, Eli. He was hugging his stuffed bird, the one I'd given him when he was 3, the one he called Mr. Button's End. His little face was streaked with tears. When he saw me, his eyes went wide with a mixture of hope and terror. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice so small, so broken. "Grandma, you came." I was across that garage floor in an instant, dropping to my knees despite the protest from my old joints, gathering that child into my arms. He was shaking, actually shaking, his small body trembling like a leaf in a storm. "Oh, baby," I murmured, holding him tight. "Oh, my sweet boy. What happened? Why are you out here?" He buried his face against my shoulder, and I could feel the wetness of his tears soaking through my coat. "Please don't tell Daddy," he whimpered. "Please, Grandma. She'll be mad again if you tell. She gets so mad." "Who gets mad?" I wanted to scream the question, but I already knew the answer. Melissa. My daughter-in-law. The woman who'd systematically cut me out of my family's life. The woman who'd done this to my grandson. I carried Eli out of that garage, and let me tell you, at 73, carrying a 7-year-old isn't easy. but I would have carried him through fire if I had to. I marched right up to the back door and pounded on it with all the fury of a grandmother who'd just found her grandchild locked up like an animal. Daniel, Melissa, open this door right now. My voice was shaking with rage, with fear, with a protective fury I didn't know I was still capable of feeling. The door opened, and there stood my son. But he wasn't the Daniel I knew. This man was a ghost, a shadow. His face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes that made him look 10 years older. His shoulders were hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. And when he saw me holding Eli, when he realized what I'd discovered, the color drained from his face completely. "Mom," he breathed. "Mom, I can explain." But before he could finish, Melissa appeared behind him. She looked exactly as she always did, perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive athleisure wear, makeup flawless, even at this late hour. But her eyes, when they landed on me, were cold as ice. "Margaret," she said, and there was steel in her voice. "What are you doing here?" What was I doing here? What was I doing here? I looked at this woman, this stranger who'd married my son, and I felt something shift inside me. All the politeness, all the trying to keep the peace, all the swallowing of concerns that evaporated in an instant. "What am I doing here?" I repeated, my voice low and dangerous. "I'm holding my terrified grandson who I just found locked in your garage. The question is, what have you been doing here?" Melissa? Her face didn't change, but something flickered in those cold eyes. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. "He was being punished," she said simply, as if that explained everything. "He threw a tantrum at dinner. He needs to learn there are consequences for bad behavior." Consequences. Punished. She said these words as if they were reasonable, as if locking a 7-year-old child in a dark garage was normal parenting. I felt Eli trembling harder against me, felt his small hands clutching my coat. "Daniel," I said, turning to my son, willing him to be the man I'd raised. "Daniel, tell me you didn't know about this. Tell me you didn't let this happen." The silence that followed was deafening. My son stood there, eyes downcast, shoulders shaking, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the words that broke my heart. "She made me do it, Mom. She made me lock him up. I didn't want to. I swear I didn't want to. But she said, if I didn't." He couldn't finish. He just stood there, a grown man reduced to a frightened child himself, and I realized with dawning horror that my son wasn't just complicit, he was a victim too. "Get out," Melissa said suddenly, her voice cutting through the moment like a knife. "This is none of your business, Margaret. This is our home, our child, our rules. You need to leave, now." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw what I should have seen years ago. This wasn't just a difficult woman or a controlling wife. This was someone dangerous, someone who'd systematically isolated my son, who'd turned him into a shell of himself, who'd abused my grandson and made my son complicit in that abuse. This was a monster wearing a beautiful mask, and I'll be damned if I was going to let her win. "No," I said quietly. "I'm not leaving, not without my grandson, not tonight." Melissa's eyes narrowed. "You have no legal right to take him anywhere. He's our son. If you try to remove him from this property, I'll call the police and have you arrested for kidnapping." She would do it, too. I could see it in her face. She'd use the system, use her money, use everything at her disposal to maintain control. "Fine," I said, thinking fast. "Then I'll stay here, on your property, all night if I have to. And if anything happens to this child or to Daniel, I will call the police myself." We stood there in a standoff, this woman and I, while my son stood paralyzed between us, and my grandson clung to me like I was the only solid thing in his world. Finally, Melissa smiled, but it was the kind of smile a shark makes before it bites. "Suit yourself," she said. "Daniel, your mother can sleep in the guest room tonight. Since she's so concerned." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, leaving Daniel and me standing there with Eli between us. My son wouldn't meet my eyes. "Mom," he started, but I held up my hand. "Not now," I said quietly. "Right now, I'm taking Eli upstairs. I'm giving him a bath, and I'm putting him to bed, in a real bed where he belongs. And tomorrow, Daniel, tomorrow, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about what's been happening in this house." He nodded, just a small, defeated movement of his head, and I carried my grandson inside. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the guest room, a room that was impersonally decorated, like a hotel, with none of the warmth a real home should have, and I listened, listened for any sounds of distress, any indication that Melissa was retaliating for my interference. But the house was silent, too. Silent. It was the kind of silence that comes from fear, from everyone holding their breath, waiting for the next explosion. I thought about my son, the sweet boy he'd been. Daniel had always been gentle, sensitive, the kind of child who cried when he found an injured bird and brought it home for me to help. He'd grown into a kind man, a good man. How had he ended up here, in this situation? When had he lost himself so completely? The next morning, I woke early and went downstairs to find Melissa, already in the kitchen, dressed for the gym, sipping a green smoothie. She looked at me with that same cool expression. "Coffee's in the pot," she said, as if nothing had happened, as if the previous night had been perfectly normal. I poured myself a cup with shaking hands and sat at the kitchen island. "Where's Daniel?" I asked. "At work. He left at 6:30. He has an important meeting." Of course he did. Of course she'd made sure he was gone before I could talk to him. "And Eli, getting ready for school." She glanced at her expensive watch. "His bus comes in 20 minutes. She was going to send him to school. After last night, after being locked in a garage. As if nothing was wrong. "Melissa," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, trying to be reasonable, even though every fiber of my being wanted to scream. "We need to talk about what happened last night. That's not acceptable discipline. That's abuse." Her expression didn't change. "You're from a different generation, Margaret. Parenting has evolved. Sometimes children need to be isolated to think about their behavior. It's called a timeout. Maybe if more parents disciplined their children properly, we wouldn't have the entitled generation we have today." A timeout. She'd just called, locking a 7-year-old in a cold, dark garage for hours. A timeout. I gripped my coffee cup so hard I thought it might shatter. "That wasn't a timeout, Melissa. That was cruel. And you made Daniel do it. You've done something to my son, turned him into someone I don't recognize." "Daniel," she interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp as broken glass, "is weak. He's always been weak. When I met him, he was a mama's boy who couldn't make a decision without calling you first. I've made him stronger. I've made him successful. His career has advanced more in the 5 years we've been married than it did in the entire decade before me. He has this house, this life, because of me, because I pushed him, because I didn't let him settle for mediocrity." The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that made me sick to my stomach. "You've isolated him," I said slowly, "from me, from his friends, from everyone who cared about him. You've broken him down so thoroughly that he does whatever you say, even when it means hurting his own child." Melissa set down her smoothie cup with a precise click. "I've made him into a man instead of a boy. There's a difference. And as for Eli, he's learning the same lesson. In this world, you either follow the rules or you suffer the consequences. I'm preparing both of them for reality." This woman was insane. Or something worse than insane. She was calculated, cold, and completely convinced that she was right. "I'm going to stop you," I said quietly. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to stop you from hurting my family." She smiled, and it was the most chilling thing I'd ever seen. "No, Margaret, you're not. Because if you try to cause problems, if you try to take Eli, if you call any authorities, if you make any accusations, I will destroy Daniel's career. I will take Eli somewhere you'll never find him. I have resources, connections, and the best lawyers money can buy. You're just a lonely old widow. Who do you think people will believe?" I left that house feeling defeated in a way I'd never felt before. She was right. I was just an old woman. I didn't have money or power or connections. What could I possibly do against someone like Melissa? I drove home in a daze, parked in my driveway, and sat there for a long time, just staring at my steering wheel. That's when I thought about Thomas. My late husband, Thomas, had been a police officer for 30 years. He'd dealt with all kinds of people, criminals, abusers, manipulators. And he'd taught me something important. The truth always leaves evidence. Always. You just have to be smart enough to find it and brave enough to use it. That afternoon, I made a decision. If Melissa wanted to play games, if she wanted to threaten me and my family, then fine. But I'd spent 73 years on this earth, and I'd learned a thing or two about fighting for what matters. I was going to take her down, but I had to be smart about it. I had to be patient, and I had to gather proof. The first thing I did was go shopping. Not at my usual grocery store, but at one of those electronic stores where they sell all kinds of gadgets. I felt completely out of my element. surrounded by young people talking about megabytes and processors, but I approached a kind-looking young man and said, "I need your help. I need to record conversations very clearly, without anyone knowing." He looked at me curiously, probably wondering what an old woman needed with spy equipment, but he didn't ask questions. He showed me a small digital recorder, no bigger than a USB drive, with excellent sound quality and long battery life. "My grandfather uses something like this," he said. "He's writing his memoirs and records his thoughts. It's really easy to use." I bought it, along with a small camera pen that could record video, though I wasn't sure I'd need that. When I got home, I spent hours figuring out how to use the recorder, practicing with it, making sure I understood every function. Then, I did something I'd seen in a movie once. I carefully cut a small opening in Mr. Button's, Eli's stuffed bear, and tucked the recorder inside, making sure it was secure but could still pick up sound clearly. I sewed it back up, so carefully that you couldn't tell it had been altered unless you were looking for it. Next, I needed to reconnect with Daniel privately. That wouldn't be easy with Melissa monitoring everything, but I had to try. I sent him a text message, something innocuous. "Honey, I left my reading glasses at your house. Mind if I stop by after work to pick them up? I could pick up some dinner for everyone." It was a lie. I had my glasses right here on my kitchen table, but I needed an excuse. He texted back almost immediately, "Mom, I'll drop them off at your place this weekend." No, that wouldn't work. I needed to see him at his house, needed to get Melissa comfortable with me coming around. I texted back, "I need them tonight, dear. I have a book club meeting tomorrow. It'll just take a minute. I promise not to be in the way." There was a long pause. Then, "Okay. Come around 6. Melissa's taking Eli to soccer practice." Perfect. That would give me time alone with Daniel. When I arrived at 6 that evening, I found my son sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He looked up when I came in, and I saw tears on his face. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." I sat down across from him and took his hands in mine. They were shaking. "Daniel, baby, tell me everything. Tell me when this started. Tell me how it got this bad." And he did. Over the next hour, my son poured out a story that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. He told me how Melissa had been wonderful, at first charming, successful, seemingly perfect, how he'd felt lucky that someone like her would choose him. But after the wedding, things changed. Slowly at first. She criticized his clothes, his friends, his job. She said his friends were losers who were holding him back. She said I was overbearing and that he needed to establish boundaries. He'd believed her at first, thought maybe she was right, that he needed to grow up and be more independent, so he'd pulled away from his friends, pulled away from me, focused on his career because that's what she wanted. Then came the controlling behavior. She needed to know where he was at all times. She checked his phone, his emails, his social media. If he was 5 minutes late coming home from work, she'd explode, accusing him of cheating or lying. If he defended himself, she'd give him the silent treatment for days, making the house so cold and miserable that he'd apologize just to make it stop. "I kept thinking it would get better," Daniel said, wiping his eyes. "I kept thinking maybe I was the problem, maybe I just needed to try harder. And when Eli was born, I thought maybe having a baby would change things, make her happier." But it had only gotten worse. Melissa saw Eli as an extension of herself, a project to be perfected. When he was a toddler and had normal tantrums, she'd lose her temper, screaming at him, sometimes locking him in his room for hours. Daniel had tried to intervene, but Melissa had threatened to leave and take Eli with her. She said she'd tell everyone I was abusive. Daniel whispered. She said, with her family's lawyers, she'd make sure I never saw my son again, and I believed her. Mom, I was so scared of losing Eli that I just started doing what she said, even when she made me punish him in ways I knew were wrong. "The garage thing started 6 months ago," he continued, his voice hollow. "Eli had gotten a bad grade on a spelling test. She said he needed to learn that failure wasn't acceptable. She told me to lock him in the garage for an hour. I said no, I refused. And she, He paused, swallowing hard. She told me that if I didn't do it, she'd do something worse. She'd withhold food from him for a day. At least the garage wasn't permanent," she said. "At least he'd be safe there." So God help me, Mom, I did it. I locked my own son in the garage. And he looked at me with these eyes, these betrayed, terrified eyes, and I hated myself. I've hated myself every day since, but I didn't know what else to do. I was trapped. We were both trapped. I sat there, listening to my son's confession, feeling the weight of his pain and fear and guilt. This was psychological abuse, pure and simple. Melissa had systematically broken down my son's sense of self, isolated him from support systems, and made him complicit in abusing his own child. It was a textbook case of domestic violence. But because the victim was a man, because the abuser was a woman, because it wasn't physical violence, nobody had noticed. Nobody had helped. Daniel, I said firmly, squeezing his hands, we're going to fix this. We're going to get you and Eli out of this situation. But I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say. He looked at me with hope and fear warring in his expression. How, Mom? She's too powerful. She'd destroy us. No, I said. She won't, because we're going to be smarter than her. We're going to document everything she does. Every threat, every cruel word, every instance of abuse. And when we have enough evidence, we're going to make sure she can never hurt you or Eli again. I explained my plan. I gave him the modified Mr. Buttons and told him to make sure Eli kept it with him as much as possible, especially at home. I showed Daniel how to secretly record conversations on his phone. There were apps for that. I told him to keep a written journal of every incident, every threat, every act of cruelty, with dates and times. Can you do that? I asked. Can you be strong enough to do this? He nodded slowly. For Eli. I'll do anything for Eli. And for yourself, too, I added. Daniel, you deserve better than this. You deserve to be free. Over the next several weeks, I became a woman on a mission. I visited their house more frequently, always with some excuse, bringing groceries, picking up a dish I'd supposedly left behind, dropping off clothes I'd found on sale that I thought Eli might like. Melissa didn't like it. I could tell, but she couldn't exactly ban me from seeing my family without raising suspicions. Each visit, I paid attention to everything. I noted Melissa's behavior toward both Daniel and Eli. I watched how Eli flinched when she raised her voice. I saw how Daniel seemed to walk on eggshells, choosing his words carefully, always trying to anticipate her moods. I befriended the neighbors more openly now, especially Betty Henderson. Over coffee in her kitchen, Betty shared more concerns. Just last week, she told me, I heard terrible screaming. It was that Melissa, yelling about something being wrong with dinner. And then I heard what sounded like something breaking. The next day I saw Daniel taking garbage bags out, and it looked like broken dishes. Another neighbor, Jim Torres, who lived directly next door, mentioned seeing Eli sitting alone on the back porch late at night on several occasions. It seemed odd, Jim said. What's a little kid doing outside at 10, 11 o'clock at night? I thought about calling someone, but I didn't want to interfere. I encouraged them both to document what they'd seen and heard, writing down dates and times if they could remember them. Meanwhile, Daniel was gathering evidence from inside the house. The recorder, in Mr. Buttons, captured several damning conversations in one. Melissa could be heard berating Eli for spilling juice, calling him stupid and worthless, and threatening to lock him in the dark place if he couldn't learn to be more careful. In another, she was threatening Daniel, telling him that if he didn't force Eli to practice piano for 2 hours even though the child was sick, she'd make his life a living hell. The worst recording came 3 weeks into our evidence gathering. Daniel had left his phone recording while he was supposedly in the shower. Melissa was putting Eli to bed, and the conversation she had with that child was pure poison. Your father is weak, she told him. He's a disappointment. You will not grow up to be like him. You will be strong. You will be perfect. Do you understand me? And when Eli, in his small voice, said, but Daddy's nice. I love Daddy. Melissa's response was chilling. Love makes you weak. Love is for people who can't survive on their own. You don't need love. You need discipline and standards. Now go to sleep. And if I hear one sound from this room tonight, you'll spend tomorrow night in the garage. I listened to these recordings in my living room, tears streaming down my face, my hands shaking with rage and grief. This woman was systematically destroying a child's spirit, warping his understanding of love and family, creating trauma that would take years of therapy to undo. It could be undone at all, but these recordings were gold. They were undeniable proof of emotional abuse. Along with Daniel's journal and the neighbors' statements, we were building a case. But I knew we needed more. We needed something that would make authorities take immediate action, something that would protect Daniel and Eli right away. That's when I thought of the physical evidence. I asked Daniel to photograph any bruises or marks on Eli. There weren't many. Melissa was careful, and her abuse was primarily There were a few. A bruise on Eli's arm from where she'd grabbed him to heart. A small burn on his hand from when she'd taught him a lesson about not touching the stove by holding his hand close to it. Daniel documented everything, sent me the photos. Each one made me sick to my stomach. I also encouraged Daniel to document the food situation. Melissa controlled what Eli ate obsessively, often withholding meals as punishment. Daniel started taking photos of Eli's dinner, sometimes just a piece of plain chicken and some vegetables, portion sizes that were far too small for a growing 7-year-old. He photographed the locked pantry. Melissa had put a lock on the pantry so Eli couldn't sneak food. On the nights when Eli was being punished, Daniel photographed his empty plate, his hollow, sad eyes staring at it. We compiled everything into Retries Concha photos, written statements from neighbors, Daniel's detailed journal. It was damning, that was irrefutable. But I knew that confronting Melissa directly could be dangerous. She could destroy evidence, manipulate the situation, or even hurt Daniel and Eli in retaliation. I needed to be strategic about how we used this information. That's when I reached out to a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I found a firm that specialized in domestic violence cases and had experience with male victims. When I called and explained the situation, the lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, agreed to meet with me immediately. Patricia listened to everything, reviewed our evidence, and nodded seriously. "This is absolutely abuse," she said, "both of Daniel and Eli. The challenge is that in cases like this, especially with a male victim, there's often skepticism. People don't believe that a woman can be the abuser, especially a successful, well-presented woman like Melissa sounds like. But you've done excellent work gathering evidence. Here's what we're going to do." She outlined a plan. First, Daniel needed to file for divorce and request full custody of Eli. Based on the abuse, we'd submit all our evidence with the filing. Simultaneously, we'd report the child abuse to Child Protective Services with copies of our documentation. Patricia would represent Daniel in both cases. "It's going to get ugly," Patricia warned. "Melissa will fight back with everything she has." She tried to paint Daniel as an unfit father, might even try to flip the narrative and claim he's the abuser. But with this evidence, especially the recordings of her own voice threatening the child, we have a strong case. The problem was money. Daniel didn't have much in the way of savings. Melissa controlled their finances, and Patricia's fees were substantial. "I'll pay," I said immediately. "I'll mortgage my house if I have to. Just help my family." The night before Daniel was going to file the papers, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if Melissa convinced people that Daniel was lying? What if she managed to turn the situation around? What if Eli ended up suffering more because of our actions? I got out of bed around 2 in the morning and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I got down on my knees and, let me tell you, getting down isn't easy at my age, and getting up is even harder. But I got down on my knees and I prayed. I prayed for strength, for wisdom, for protection for Daniel and Eli. I prayed that the truth would prevail, and that justice would be served. And I prayed for the courage to see this through, no matter what happened. The next morning, Daniel filed for divorce and custody. By noon, Child Protective Services had been notified and were opening an investigation. By evening, Melissa had been served with papers. And then, all hell broke loose. Melissa called me. I'd been expecting it, but that didn't make it any easier when my phone rang and her name appeared on the screen. I answered with a steady voice. "Hello, Melissa." The rage in her voice was barely controlled. "You did this. You poisoned him against me. You turned my husband and my son against me with your lies." "I didn't need to poison anyone," I said calmly. "The truth speaks for itself. You abused my grandson. You abused my son. And now, you're going to face the consequences." She laughed, but it was a bitter, twisted sound. "Consequences? You stupid old woman. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? My father is one of the most successful attorneys in the state. I will bury Daniel. I will bury you. When I'm done, Daniel won't have a job, a son, or a shred of reputation left. And you'll spend whatever pathetic years you have left alone, having destroyed your own family." "You already destroyed my family," I said. "I'm just putting it back together. And as for your threats, Melissa, I have something you don't have. I have the truth. I have recordings of you threatening a 7-year-old child. I have photographs of bruises you caused. I have witness statements from neighbors who've heard you screaming abuse. You can have all the lawyers in the world, but you can't change facts." The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought she'd hung up then. In a voice so cold it could freeze fire, she said, "This isn't over, Margaret, not by a long shot." And she did hang up then. That night, Daniel and Eli came to stay with me. A temporary custody arrangement had been put in place, supervised visits only for Melissa, until the investigation was complete. When they walked through my door, both of them carrying hastily packed bags, I felt my heart break and heal at the same time. Eli ran to me immediately, wrapping his thin arms around my waist. "Grandma, Daddy said we get to stay with you. Is that true? We really get to stay?" "Yes, baby," I said, smoothing his hair. "You really get to stay, for as long as you need to." Daniel stood in my doorway looking lost, like he didn't quite know what to do with freedom. "Mom," he said quietly, "thank you. I don't know how I'll ever thank you enough." "You just did," I told him, "by being brave enough to leave, by choosing your son over fear. That's all the thanks I need." But Melissa wasn't done, true to her word. She fought back with everything she had. Her father's law firm immediately filed counterclaims, painting Daniel as an abusive, neglectful father who'd been manipulated by his overbearing mother. They claimed I had fabricated evidence, that the recordings were taken out of context, that Eli's discipline issues required firm parenting, and that Daniel had been too weak to provide it. They submitted their own evidence email Daniel had sent where he'd complained about being tired or stressed, trying to paint him as mentally unstable. They found the one time Daniel had spanked Eli years ago, after the boy had run into the street, and tried to make it seem like Daniel was the violent one. They even tried to use my age against me, suggesting that I was suffering from dementia, and had imagined or misremembered things. It was brutal. It was exhausting. There were days when Daniel would come home from meetings with lawyers looking so defeated that I worried he might give up. There were nights when I'd heard him crying in the guest room, overwhelmed by the battle we were fighting. But Child Protective Services was thorough. They interviewed Eli with the child psychologist present, and what he told them corroborated everything we'd documented. He talked about being locked in the garage, about being called stupid, about being scared of his mother's anger. The psychologist noted signs of emotional trauma consistent with sustained psychological abuse. They interviewed the neighbors, who confirmed what they'd told me. They examined our evidence and found it compelling, and they interviewed Melissa herself. That interview, I later learned from Patricia, did not go well for Melissa. She'd walked in confident, polished, ready to charm them, just like she'd charmed everyone else. But when confronted with recordings of her own voice threatening her child, she'd made a critical mistake. Instead of showing remorse or trying to explain, she'd become defensive and angry. She'd blamed Daniel for being weak, blamed Eli for being difficult, blamed me for interfering. She'd revealed herself in that interview, let the mask slip just enough that the investigators saw what lay beneath. 6 weeks after Daniel filed for divorce, Child Protective Services made their recommendation. Melissa should have only supervised visitation with Eli until she completed a psychological evaluation and parenting classes. The custody hearing was set for 2 months later. In the meantime, Daniel and Eli stayed with me, and I watched them slowly begin to heal. It wasn't easy or quick. Daniel had to start therapy to deal with the trauma of his abusive marriage. He had nightmares sometimes, would wake up in a panic thinking Melissa was in the house. He struggled with guilt over what had happened to Eli, would sometimes break down and apologize to his son for not protecting him sooner. Eli, too, had his challenges. He was terrified that his mother would come and take him back. He had anxiety about small things, spilling something, making noise, getting a question wrong on his homework. He'd been conditioned to expect punishment for the smallest mistakes. But slowly, day by day, I watched them both emerge from the shadows Melissa had cast over their lives. We established loving routines that had nothing to do with control. Breakfast together every morning, where we'd talk about the day ahead, and Eli could choose what he wanted to eat. Homework at the kitchen table where mistakes were learning opportunities, not failures to be punished. Stories before bed, where I'd read to Eli from the same books I'd once read to Daniel. On weekends, we'd work in my garden together, Eli delighting in getting his hands dirty, in planting seeds and watching them grow. Things grow when you give them love and patience. I told him one Saturday afternoon as we planted tomatoes. Just like people, you give them love, give them time, and they bloom. He looked up at me with those big brown eyes that were starting to regain their light and said, "Am I blooming, Grandma?" I had to swallow past the lump in my throat. "Yes, baby, you're blooming beautifully." The custody hearing arrived on a cold November morning. We all went together, me, Daniel, Patricia, and even Eli. Though he'd only be called to testify if absolutely necessary, Melissa was there with her team of expensive lawyers, looking immaculate in a designer suit, her hair and makeup perfect. When she saw us, her expression was pure contempt. The hearing lasted 2 days. Patricia presented our case methodically: the recordings, the photographs, the neighbor testimonies, the CPS reports, Daniel's journal. She painted a picture of systematic psychological abuse, of a woman who controlled and manipulated through fear and intimidation. Melissa's lawyers fought back hard. They tried to discredit our evidence, questioned the legality of the recordings. Patricia had made sure everything we did was legal, tried to paint Melissa as a devoted mother with high standards in a world that was too soft on children. They brought in a child psychologists of their own who testified that firm discipline wasn't abuse, that children needed structure and consequences. But then Patricia did something brilliant. She'd subpoenaed Melissa's own therapist. Melissa had been seeing someone, ironically, for stress management. The therapist, bound by a court order and by the limits of confidentiality when child safety is concerned, testified that Melissa had discussed her frustration with Eli's defiance and had mentioned using creative discipline techniques that had made the therapists uncomfortable enough to suggest parenting classes. Melissa had refused, claiming she knew better than some touchy-feely therapist how to raise her own child. The therapist had documented these concerns. It was damning. But the moment that truly sealed Melissa's fate came on the second day. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Morrison, asked Melissa to take the stand under oath. Melissa was asked directly, "Did you instruct your husband to lock your 7-year-old son in the garage as punishment?" I watched Melissa's face. She could have shown remorse. She could have admitted she'd made mistakes and needed help. But instead, she lifted her chin and said, "Yes, I did, and I'd do it again." Children need to learn that there are consequences for bad behavior. A few hours in a safe garage is hardly abuse. People today coddle their children and then wonder why they grow up to be entitled and weak. I was teaching my son a valuable lesson. The courtroom went silent. Even her own lawyers looked stunned. Judge Morrison stared at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Mrs. Sullivan, do you understand that what you just described is legally defined as child abuse in this state?" Melissa's confidence finally flickered. "That's ridiculous. It's discipline. Parents should have the right to discipline their children as they see fit, not when that discipline causes psychological harm," the judge said, "not when it constitutes cruel treatment. Mrs. Sullivan, I've reviewed all the evidence in this case, and I've listened to your testimony here today. I'm deeply troubled by what I've seen and heard." 2 weeks later, the judge issued her ruling. Daniel was awarded full custody of Eli. Melissa was granted supervised visitation only, limited to 2 hours per week in a supervised facility, contingent on her completing a psychological evaluation, anger management courses, and parenting classes. She was also ordered to pay child support. The divorce proceedings continued, but with the custody issue settled, Daniel had won the most important battle. I'll never forget the moment we got the news. We were in my living room, me, Daniel, and Eli. Patricia called with the judge's decision, and when Daniel hung up, he just stood there for a moment, processing. Then he fell to his knees and started sobbing, huge, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep in his soul. Years of pain and fear and guilt poured out of him while Eli and I held him. "It's over," he kept saying. "It's really over. She can't hurt us anymore." Eli, not fully understanding but feeling his father's emotion, started crying too. "Daddy, are you okay? Are you sad?" Daniel pulled his son into a fierce hug. "No, buddy, I'm not sad. These are happy tears. We're safe now. We're finally safe." I held them both, my son and my grandson, and I let myself cry too. Happy tears, sad tears, relieved tears all mixed together. But there was one more chapter to this story, one more encounter I had to face. About 3 months after the custody decision, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Melissa. The envelope was expensive stationery, her handwriting perfect and controlled. For a moment, I considered throwing it away without reading it. What could she possibly have to say that I'd want to hear? But curiosity got the better of me. I opened it and read, "Margaret, I'm writing this against the advice of my attorneys, but there are things I need to say. The supervised visits with Eli are humiliating. Sitting in that sterile room with a social worker watching my every move. Having only 2 hours a week with my own son, it's degrading. More than that, it's not working. Eli is distant with me. He barely speaks during our visits. He flinches when I reach for him. I've lost my son, and I'm being forced to examine how that happened. The court-mandated therapy is making me confront some difficult truths about myself, about my childhood, about the way I learned to see love and control as the same thing. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I'm not even sure I fully understand yet what I did wrong. My therapist tells me that's part of the problem, that my normal meter is broken, but I am beginning to see that the way I treated Daniel and Eli was harmful, that fear shouldn't be a parenting tool, that I damaged the people I claimed to love. I'm especially haunted by something Eli said during one of our supervised visits. The social worker asked him to tell me about his week, and he talked about planting vegetables with you in your garden. He was so animated, so happy. Then he looked at me and said, "Grandma says love makes things grow. You just have to be patient." And I realized I was never patient. I never truly loved them in the way they needed. I tried to shape them, control them, make them into what I thought they should be. That's not love. I don't expect you to respond to this letter. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that you are right to stop me. Whatever happens in my future, whatever relationship I may or may not have with Eli as he grows up, at least now he's safe. At least now he has a chance to grow up without fear. That's because of you. Melissa, I read that letter 3 times, trying to figure out how I felt about it. Was it genuine remorse, or was it manipulation? One more attempt to control the narrative. I'd never know for sure. What I did know was that it didn't change anything. Melissa had hurt my family, and the consequences of that were hers to bear. I wrote Baka. Short response. Melissa, I hope you find genuine healing and understanding. I hope you truly learn to love without control. But my focus now is on helping Daniel and Eli heal from what they endured. That takes all my energy and all my love. I wish you well on your journey, but that journey is separate from ours now. I never heard from her again. The supervised visits continued for a while, but gradually, Eli asked to see her less and less. Eventually, he stopped going altogether. Melissa didn't fight it, whether that was growth on her part or just resignation. I couldn't say. Life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. Daniel got his own place after about a year, a small house not far from mine, cheerful and filled with light. Nothing like the cold, perfect home he'd shared with Melissa. He continued therapy and gradually rebuilt his confidence. His career, which Melissa had threatened to destroy, actually flourished once he was free from her control. Turned out he was brilliant at his job when he wasn't constantly walking on eggshells. Eli thrived. He was still in therapy too, working through his trauma with a wonderful child psychologist who specialized in abuse cases. But more and more, I could see the real Eli emerging, funny, curious, creative, kind. He made friends at school. He joined Little League. He laughed, really laughed, the kind of belly laughs that kids should have. One day, about 2 years after everything happened, I was in my garden with Eli. He was 9 now, growing tall and strong. We were harvesting tomatoes, and he turned to me and said, "Grandma, I don't remember a lot about when I was little and lived with Mom and Dad together. Sometimes I try to remember, and it's just fuzzy. Is that weird?" I put down my basket and knelt beside his ear, now that my knees had gotten used to gardening. "No, baby, that's not weird. That's your brain protecting you. It's okay to not remember. What matters is now, and now is pretty good, isn't it?" He smiled, that beautiful smile that lit up his whole face. "Now is really good, Grandma. Now is the best." And that, right there, made every difficult moment worth it. Every confrontation, every legal battle, every sleepless night, it was all worth it to see this child smile without fear. Daniel eventually started dating again. It took him a long time to trust someone, but eventually he met a woman named Sarah Kind, gentle kindergarten teacher who understood his past and never pushed him to move faster than he was ready. When he introduced her to Eli, I watched carefully, protective, as always. But Eli liked her immediately. "She's nice, Grandma, he told me later. She asks me questions and really listens to the answers. And she doesn't yell, ever. That's what a good person does, I told him. They listen. They're patient. They don't need to yell or control to feel powerful. He nodded thoughtfully. Like you. That simple statement, like you, became one of my most treasured memories. As for me, I learned something important through all of this. I learned that age doesn't mean powerlessness, that being a grandmother doesn't mean stepping back and accepting whatever happens. Sometimes love means fighting. Sometimes it means being uncomfortable, taking risks, standing up to people who seem more powerful than you. I'd spent my whole life trying to keep the peace, trying not to make waves. But when it really mattered, I'd found a strength I didn't know I had. My friends from church, from book club, from the quilting circle, they all wanted to know the whole story. How had I done it? How had I found the courage to take on someone like Melissa? It wasn't courage, I told them. It was love. When someone you love is in danger, you don't think about being brave. You just act. But there were still hard days. Days when I worried about Eli, about whether the trauma he'd experienced would affect him as he grew older. Days when I questioned whether I'd done enough, or if I'd done the right things in the right way. On one of those days, Daniel found me sitting in my garden, staring at nothing in particular. He sat down beside me on the old wooden bench Thomas had built years ago. "What's wrong, Mom?" "Just thinking," I said, "worrying, really, about whether you and Eli will really be okay in the long run." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Mom, do you remember when I was a kid and I fell off my bike, scraped up my knees pretty badly?" I nodded. I remembered he'd been about 8, had tried to ride without training wheels before he was ready. "You cleaned me up, bandaged my knees, and then you told me something. You said, scars are just proof that you healed." I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Eli and I, we're going to have scars from what Melissa did, but we're healing, Mom, because of you. We're healing. That conversation stayed with me. Scars are proof that you healed. We were all healing, slowly but surely. Now, as I sit here telling you this story, it's been 5 years since that night I found Eli in the garage. He's 12 now, a bright, happy middle schooler who wants to be a veterinarian because he loves animals. Daniel and Sarah got married last year, a small, beautiful ceremony in my garden where it all began. Melissa sent a card congratulating them. Nothing more. She moved to another state, I heard, trying to start over. I don't wish her ill. I just wish her gone from our lives, and that wish has been granted. Looking back, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I hadn't gone to that house that night. What if I'd just accepted the distance, accepted Daniel's excuses, convinced myself that everything was fine? How much worse would things have gotten? How much more damage would have been done to an innocent child, to my son? But I did go, I did find him, and I did fight back. Sometimes I think about other families out there, other grandparents who might be sensing that something's wrong but are afraid to interfere, afraid to make waves. If you're listening to this and you're in that situation, let me tell you something. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Being family doesn't mean having the right to abuse. Love shouldn't hurt. Love shouldn't control. Love shouldn't make people afraid. And if you need to fight for someone you love, fight. You're not too old. You're not too powerless. You're not just one person against the world. You're a grandmother, a grandfather, a parent, a human being who loves someone who needs protecting. That's not weakness. That's the greatest strength there is. These days, my little house on Maple Street is full of life and laughter again. Eli comes over after school most days, does his homework at my kitchen table while I make cookies. Daniel stops by for dinner on Sundays, sometimes with Sarah, sometimes just the two of them. We work in the garden together, watch the things we plant grow and flourish, just like our family has grown and flourished. Last week, Eli asked me to help him with a school project. He had to write about someone who inspired him, someone who taught him an important lesson. He chose to write about me. As I listened to him read his essay about how I taught him that love means protecting people, that standing up for what's right is always worth it, that family is worth fighting for, I felt tears rolling down my cheeks. "That's beautiful, honey," I told him. "But you know what? You taught me something too. What's that? You taught me that it's never too late to be brave, that age is just a number when love is on the line, that healing is possible, even when things seem broken beyond repair. He hugged me then, this boy who used to flinch at sudden movements, who used to be afraid of his own shadow. He hugged me tight and said, "I love you, Grandma. I love you too, baby, more than you'll ever know." As I watch him now, playing in the yard with the dogs Sarah and Daniel rescued last year, I think about that night 5 years ago, the night that changed everything. The night I found my grandson locked in a garage and discovered that sometimes the people we love most need us to be warriors, not peacekeepers. I'm 78 years old now. My knees hurt more than they used to. I get tired easier. I've earned every one of my gray hairs and every line on my face, but I've also earned something else, the knowledge that when it really mattered, I didn't back down. I didn't stay quiet. I fought for my family and I won. That's not something everyone can say at the end of their life. And you know what? I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. So that's my story. Friends, it's not an easy one. It's not comfortable, but it's real. It's about the darkness that can hide in plain sight, about the courage it takes to confront it, and about the healing that's possible on the other side. If you take anything away from this, let it be this. Don't ignore your instincts when someone you love is in danger. Don't let fear of conflict keep you from protecting the innocent. Don't let anyone convince you that you're powerless just because you're older, or because you're just a grandparent. You're not powerless, you're needed. And sometimes, you're the only one who can make a difference. Thank you for listening to an old woman's story today. Thank you for letting me share this piece of my heart with you. I hope it touches you, teaches you, maybe even inspires you. And I hope that if you're ever faced with a choice between keeping the peace and protecting someone you love, you choose love. Every single time. Until tomorrow, my dear friends, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. This is Grandma Maggie, reminding you that the strongest force in the world isn't wealth or power or even youth, it's love, backed by courage. And that combination can move mountains, break chains, and save lives. God bless you all.